All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. The issue is a tech issue, and this is why we're getting started a little late. We might have to forego a bit of a break in the middle of this just so we don't keep you over time. I will be letting people in as they log in and find the link that went missing mysteriously. Before I do that, though, I want to welcome everyone. We were expecting our board chair, but I think in the midst of all the technical difficulties, she won't be with us this morning or this afternoon, but our board chair is Erin Corbett-Wright. She is our newly elected chair. She's also senior manager for workforce development at Salesforce. She is an inspiration. But in order for us to get to actual content and make sure we're not keeping you, I'm going to actually move us to SVP's story and then go from there. So welcome everyone again. My name is Edurne, but please call me Eddie. I use she, her pronouns, and I am SVP Philadelphia's lead for community impact. That means that I manage the development and implementation of our grant-making, capacity building, and learning initiatives. Before we officially meet Sam and Alicia from the Equitable Wealth Initiative, I'd like to share SVP's story or history to express SVP's commitment to grounding our work in history and practicing transparency, which is a tenet of trust-based philanthropy. All right. As a trust-based giving model, SVP acknowledges we operate within the boundaries of institutional philanthropy, and that the history of institutional philanthropy in the US was often violent and perpetuated much of what we're about to discuss today. And for those who are unfamiliar with the concept of institutional philanthropy, I'm referring to the foundations, corporate funders, and other players who deploy their own financial resources strategically, are independently governed, or use private resources for public good. And if you see me looking away for a little bit, it's because I'm trying to admit individuals into the room as we go, so don't mind me. SVP understands we are not the solution or the one solution to disrupting intergenerational poverty. Rather, we understand SVP is a mechanism used to atone for past harms while disrupting interpersonal structures that perpetuate intergenerational poverty. So, our story. In 2019, SVP Philadelphia was established as an affiliate of SVP International, a worldwide network of philanthropists who come together in their respective cities to address issues impacting their area of the world. In that same year, Reducing Poverty Together, Implementing an Engaged Social Venture Partners Philanthropic Model in Philadelphia was published. This feasibility report asked whether there was a need for another giving circle, what are current giving circles offering their donors and grantees alike, and what could set SVP Philly apart from other philanthropic entities. In 2020, and armed with recommendations from the report, SVP adopted a trust-based philanthropic approach, meaning we solidified our focus or our energy on BIPOC-led and empowering poverty-fighting nonprofits. We began to think through how to best center equity in all our policies and practices, and we developed frameworks for grant-making and nonprofit capacity building initiatives. Between 2020, 2022, COVID-19 hit, and the murders of George Floyd and other Black Americans at that time spurred SVP to invest $33,000 in grants to 3 racial justice organizations, making that SVP's first official grant cycle. SVP used this momentum to edge closer to a trust-based philanthropic entity by following that first round of grants with 2 rounds of multi-year investments totaling $900,000 between 6 nonprofits. And you can see the names of those nonprofits on this slide. We hosted 22 learning sessions for our donors, who we call partners only. And those sessions ranged from everything from introduction to nonprofits to bias, poverty in Philadelphia, and history of philanthropy. At the same time, we launched a pilot of our nonprofit capacity building model to support our grantees. Based on lessons learned from the last 3 years in 2023, we reinforced our commitment to trust-based philanthropy by tiering our educational programming in a way that engages non-SVP partners in our work or community members in our work, and allows room for SVP donors, who again we call partners, to engage much more intentionally in grant making and capacity building through a trust-based framework. Today, everyone on this call, if you've managed to get here, is experiencing the first level of SVP's tiered approach to learning. We hope you leave here today with increased knowledge of SVP and our key concepts, right? We hope you leave with stretched critical thinking muscles and that you've left here wanting more. So I am gonna stop sharing my screen so Alicia and Sam can set up. I want to remind everyone that because there are quite a number of you on this call, that you stay muted. If you have any questions, go ahead and submit them into the chat box. We'll be monitoring that. Depending on how this goes, right? We will have time for Q&A. If not, then yeah, I definitely encourage you to put your questions into the chat box. And we will get to them. At the end of this, I will make sure everyone has all of our contact information so you can learn more about SVP, me, but also very importantly, especially in this session, you can learn about Samantha and Alicia and the Equitable Wealth Initiative. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Sam and Alicia, keep letting people into the room, and I'll see you at the end of this presentation. So take it away, Alicia and Sam.
Well, I want to say good afternoon to everyone. And Eddie, thank you for the invitation to join. My name is Samantha Porter. I am the Senior Manager and Community Engagement Advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And my co-host and co-collaborator in this work, Alicia Atkinson, she will introduce herself. We're going to run through a presentation, but we hope that this is also a space that feels interactive, that feels open. So use the chat, please. I know they asked, because we're recording, to keep yourselves on mute, but if you'd like to use the chat, we're going to do our best to try to keep track of that. We're here today to talk about a really exciting project, and it's close to our hearts because we dreamed it up in a cafe, you know, over a year ago. It's been almost 2 years, to really start to think about how you center wealth and the racial wealth gap in our conversations around poverty. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that's important in our presentation today. Before we dive in into what is the Equitable Wealth Initiative and why does that relate to the work and learning that you all are doing, I want to give my favorite Fed disclaimer. The views expressed here today are mine or are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank or the Federal Reserve System. So with that, we can dive right into it. And I want to sort of set the stage because there's a lot that we could go over here, but want to just make it clear what we will do today, what we might do today, and what we won't do today. So what we will do today is really try to think about the importance of wealth and our current state of wealth, and in the context of the racial wealth gap. Wealth inequality is something that exists in our society, and we're all, I think, aware of that. But when we get more specific around racial wealth, the racial wealth divide, that's where we'd like to focus today. We want to lift up the role that narratives and mental models play in how we are addressing wealth. And finally, we want to talk about some of the limitations we have with understanding this issue that relate to the data that we have available. So what we might get to is dislodging some of our current thinking around this. And I'm saying that from a place that every time I go through these materials, I'm also dislodging or recognizing little pieces that remain from perhaps traditional thinking about wealth and the wealth divide that don't lead to the innovative solutions that I hope we're all trying to achieve. And what we won't do today is we were not going to give you all a deep history lesson about the racial wealth gap and its origins. I believe you all had a previous speaker who did a really wonderful job of illuminating some of that work. And so we hope that that's something that we can visit but we don't have to go deeply into. And we're also not going to come with some silver bullet solutions today, because this is a very complex topic. And to echo Eddie, we're not going to solve poverty today. We are also not going to fix the racial wealth divide in this 1-hour presentation. So we like to start off by just sharing some of our group agreements. We worked on this work in partnership with an incredible group of people who are now with the Maven Collaborative out in Oakland, California. And so we're leveraging and really happy to share their group agreements. One is to stay engaged. I know virtually there's a lot that can grab your attention, but we hope that you'll stay tuned in with us. Second is to experience a little discomfort, because we think that's the space where growth happens. So if you're open to that, we think that you can be open to growing with us in this discussion. Speak your truth. And so to the extent that folks are speaking about this issue, I would ask that you speak from your individual perspective and not speak for groups or other perspectives that you might not represent. Give each other grace, because we're all learning and growing in this space, as we already said. And then expect and respect and accept non-disclosure bars, right? That last line. Anyway, so now to get us set, I'm actually going to go to the, okay. To get us started, I'm going to turn over to Alicia to introduce herself, and then I'm going to start a little video.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Eddie, again for the invitation to present here today. And yeah, I'm really happy to be a partner in this work. I am the former managing director of financial empowerment of United Way, and have been really grateful to continue on this initiative as a consultant over the last few months. And as Sam mentioned, we are trying to summarize work that we've been at for almost 2 years now, and hoping to give you guys kind of a tasty bite of that work. And we are going to start with a video that actually we are very fortunate to have now in our toolbox when we're talking about wealth. The Boston Fed just came out with this video about a month ago. So, and really the hope is just to start thinking about the importance of wealth. Again, as Sam alluded to, the conversation around poverty often comes to income-based poverty and not asset-based poverty. And so, yeah, I will allow Sam to hopefully press play, and we'll watch this short video. You might have to unmute yourself, Sam, too. Oh.
Two saplings, two gardeners, two trees. Both gardeners work hard to nurture their plants. So why at the end does one have an orchard and the other a single apple? The picture is more complex than it might appear at first. Hard work alone is only part of the story behind someone's prosperity. Past and present policies and practices that have excluded people of color and women and led to the isolation of some places from economic opportunity have created vastly unequal landscapes. These differences profoundly impact a family's ability to seed and grow wealth. Wealth, or net wealth, refers to the total value of one's assets minus debts. And how families build and maintain wealth is critical to understanding why some families thrive, while others struggle despite also working hard and playing by the rules. Wealth is important to family well-being, but often operates behind the scenes. It's an unseen force, separate from individual effort or ingenuity, that can determine a family's chances at success. What this means is that hard work alone is often not enough to build and grow wealth. Access to private and public investments helps personal wealth, like saplings, to be nurtured and grow and yield more fruit. For example, those with access to financial and other resources from extended family and friends can leverage this to make individual investments that yield greater personal wealth. Those without such resources won't get the same returns despite working hard. Social investments also play an important role in helping families build and protect wealth. Some communities have received deliberate public and private investment, and others have faced active disinvestment. That means some communities are well-resourced, with things like better schools, utilities, and parks, making them a more desirable and in turn valuable place to live. Taken together, policy and practice, alongside differences in extended family support and social investments, shape an individual's ability to build and grow personal wealth, meaning hard work alone is often not enough. Wealth, in addition to being a resource that can be invested for future growth, also acts as a buffer in times of crisis. Without this buffer, every crisis, like a job loss or medical bill, has the potential to become a catastrophe. When you have access to a lot of resources, it's easier to turn your own investment, like a sapling, into an orchard. Wealth begets wealth. And as resources are passed down from one generation to the next, those with access can give their children and grandchildren a head start. A cycle that continues to expand existing wealth divides. Every family wants to secure a stable future for their children. But white families have accumulated 10 times more wealth than black families. And single women of color own pennies on the dollar held by single white males, because the playing field has not been level, and isn't today. And when some families face restricted opportunities to grow wealth, that limits our potential for a fully productive economy. Learn more about how New England stakeholders can help create a more equitable playing field for all families in our region.
Awesome. Thank you,
Join the
Sam.
conversation.
Thank you for managing the tech as always. Yeah, so I, except for the New England part at the end, we can scratch that and just think about our ecosystem here in Philadelphia. But just want to offer a few reflections on that video. Again, this is maybe material you all have heard before, but I think this really is important to take a moment and really seep our minds into, of really the power of wealth, of, you know, again, what was mentioned, being able to protect against economic shocks and crisis, the ability to invest in things. I think the whole idea that wealth begets wealth, you know, there are things that we're going to talk about later about this kind of the go-to solutions around wealth, closing the racial wealth gap. But what they're kind of uncovering now is that actually wealth is a precursor to things like education and home ownership, and even a job being those economic mobility mechanisms that we believe them to be. I think wealth also just creates this idea of, you could see through the different scenarios, this idea of living with more dignity, more choice. We talk a lot about like the ability to leave a job that's not treating you well, or maybe you're getting underpaid, the ability to go back to school and not finance these opportunities through debt, I think becomes a really important conversation. Wealth is intergenerational. I think that's a really important key when we're thinking about our city, a city that is plagued in intergenerational poverty. How are we really thinking about these long-term investments, long-term solutions? And I think, again, the point was driven home, which we will continue to talk about, this idea of individual behavior, this idea of income, this idea of consumption versus kind of these longer term investments that some people I believe at the Boston Fed coined this term called magic money. And this idea that really, this idea of money really being able to grow onto itself. I will plug that Ezra Klein actually had the economist Derek Hamilton on his podcast this last week to talk about wealth inequality. And I've given it 2 listens. And, you know, one of the things they talk about is income from 1989 to 2018 has, household income has grown at 30%, while the S&P 500 has grown about 400%. So you just think about what is making money and what is really creating those nest eggs. And I think this is a conversation we have to have that's often uncomfortable because wealth is intergenerational, and wealth is kind of the way history shows up in our pockets, which I'm going to talk about in a second more. And then, yeah, I think the other thing actually Derek Hamilton said on his podcast is just this really ability that wealth allows you to participate in our economy and participate in the market as it was imagined, I think, originally, which we don't often talk about. So yeah, the next slide we have here is really one of many we could have chosen around to really demonstrate this racial wealth gap, which is very large and persistent. So Heather McGee, who wrote The Sum of Us, me and Sam were actually very lucky to go see her speak at the Free Library a couple months ago. And she started out her talk with, wealth is the way history shows up in our pockets. And I think that's the thing about this conversation. And so appreciate SVP inviting us here today and their focus on history and their focus on systems change, and really this idea that our history and our country and our economy is built on extracted labor and free labor of people of color. And wealth is just a very powerful way to show up how these policies and practices over the last hundreds of years have really shown up to build wealth for others, and how we choose to really continue to extract wealth from other communities. I think I really appreciate the group agreements that Sam put forward. And again, want to encourage us all that, for me too, every time I start learning something more about a different system, I've gotten into Dorothy Brown's work recently called The Whiteness of Wealth, about our tax code system. And this can be really starting to be uncomfortable because it really does just show up everywhere about how interconnected wealth and the access to wealth is to the experience of poverty and generational poverty. And yeah, I wanted to say quickly as well that there's another great, I'm sorry to mention like 3 resources in about 2 minutes here, but the other thing I'll just mention is there's a great kind of figure by United for a Fair Economy about the boosts and blocks. And just again, really trying to drive home that we are making decisions about how we're removing wealth from certain communities and building wealth for others. And then the last thing that Sam already alluded to, but I want to make note of here as well, is wealth data is actually really challenging to track. As you can see here, before, sorry, the dates are very small, but there was a point where we weren't even disaggregating by race. We're still not disaggregating by race and ethnicity at a kind of enough of a level to really be tracking that in a comprehensive way. But I also just want to mention that wealth portfolios are really complex. When you think about people having housing or business assets, when you're thinking about intergenerational wealth transfers, and then you're thinking about the tax advantage accounts that we have, the 529s, the health savings accounts, the stocks, the IRAs. We really don't have a way of really tracking the nuances of how these portfolios work together. Tax data is not readily available to a lot of researchers and analysts out there. And our 4 biggest, largest data sets that we really use to kind of track our progress on poverty is really focused on income and consumption. And I think it's really important to think about how data drives conversations and drives progress. And we really have come to the conclusion that we need better data, as many people have, on this wealth problem, because as Sam is going to kind of go into around homeownership, the problems are very nuanced. And therefore, if our data is not really showing this nuanced interactions with these systems, we're can continue to kind of be like shooting in the dark. So I just wanted to emphasize that point around data still being pretty opaque in this field. Yeah, so my next little spiel here is just to talk a little bit about how the Equitable Wealth Initiative is kind of thinking about the root causes and drivers of the racial wealth gap. So the first one, Sam, if you can go to I think the next slide. As Sam mentioned, thank you. As Sam mentioned, we really centered narrative work in our initiative and continue to do so. I'm not sure if people have heard of Mia Birdsong, but she is credited for kind of talking about how narratives eat policy for breakfast. I know you all had John Kenya's work featured at the most recent Opportunity Summit by United Way, who also talks about the water systems change and this idea of mental models. But I'm going to offer kind of 2 narratives in the next 2 slides that we've really focused in on, of how can we disrupt these narratives to really make economic progress, and how these narratives have kind of continued to get in our way when we think about what we're designing forward. So the first one is just this idea of, Sam, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, awesome, thank you. So the first one is just this idea of toxic individualism and the bootstrap narrative. So this is just the narrative that we believe anyone can escape poverty if it comes to hard work and accumulate wealth by working hard and lifting themselves up by this bootstraps. Again, we are all probably intellectually familiar with this idea of neo-paternalistic policies. We're still seeing them show up today, with work requirements still being kind of argued on the federal level when it comes to these programs that are really fulfilling that basic needs for our community members. And I think the thing that I always revisit and what we're trying to say is, really this idea of poverty is a cause of moral failings or bad choices or individual behaviors. We're really missing the point on how systems have failed these communities, and policies and programs are really, again, making choices to invest in certain communities and divest and making choices to divest from others. And what we see often in philanthropic initiatives as well as policy initiatives is this focus on fixing behavior. If we could just get people to save more, if we could just get people to work harder, if we could just get people jobs, right? Like that's a lot of what our focus on. You're actually not solving intergenerational poverty. And in fact, I think we are harming communities by thinking, and we've seen this in our work, right? You see people show up and the demoralization of being in poverty and believing it's their fault. And so this is a real pervasive narrative, and it's dangerous. And so it's something that we're really focused on disrupting. The second narrative is around anti-Blackness. And these are obviously interrelated narratives, but anti-Blackness is in particular around calls into question the deservedness of Black Americans and the devaluing and dehumanizing of people who are Black. And this really keeps perpetuating our policies and institutions, our racist policies and institutions, and continues to marginalize Black Americans and disproportionately punish them. And this continues to be dangerous and harmful because we are, again, focused on individuals. We're not focused on the systems that are behind creating the conditions that these folks are experiencing. And I think we have really found with this initiative focusing on Black Americans in particular, who we believe have been most harmed and most marginalized, is going to be the most powerful way forward for us. And we really believe that anti-Blackness affects all communities. And there's some great research and studies being done on that. But this is something that we also want to center in this work and that we talk about. The next section is just around kind of this idea of moving to systemic solutions. And again, as Sam said, we cannot go through all the historical policies and practices, but I do really think it is important that people walk away with kind of this grounding of, we chose to invest in the white middle class, and that's how they exist through the GI Bill, through the Homestead Act, which to this day, actually the Homestead Act, which actually gave white Americans land. You can actually track about a quarter of white Americans' wealth back to that single entitlement program. And so when we talk about history showing up in our pockets and looking at the data of today, I think it's really important to keep in mind that these are intentional decisions that were made. And the last thing that we talk about, and we'll keep revisiting in this work, is this idea of wealth extraction. I've been in the asset building field. I went to the Heller School on Social Policy and studied under Tom Shapiro, who is a longtime researcher, in this work. And we've often talked about accumulation. So we talk a lot about getting people homes. We talk about getting people savings, but we're not often talking about how that wealth and how those homes are being devalued by systems and structures. And how, if you think about the medical field, if you think about the financial field, fines and fees disproportionately impact low-income households You talk about education, the debt holdings of education and how they disproportionately affect low income and households of color. And so we are committed to really talking about extraction and putting extraction at the head of our conversation. And yeah, I think the other thing I'll just mention before I believe I'm going to offer you all just a few moments of reflection here, because I know we just shared a lot, is this idea that extraction, I think, really is, it's a terrible experience. And I think we could all maybe reflect on our own lives of when we've been in debt, or when we've, we, in our work, we actually were able to have people talk about kind of when they like got out of student debt for the first time, and the freedom they felt and the choice they felt and the relief they felt. And so I think this idea of this debt-driven economy is really creating stress, anxiety, undignified experiences for people. It kind of leads us again to think about that anti-Blackness narrative, that bootstrap narratives. But I think it's a really important piece of the puzzle, especially when we're talking about these nuanced portfolios. So moving forward, and this kind of goes into this next slide of just, this was actually a definition offered to us by the Maven Collaborative, to really think about wealth, although we do think about it as, just this idea of assets minus debt, which I do think is important. We do want to talk about money, because and that's an important aspect of this work, but also this idea of wealth being bigger than that. So I'll just read this so we can all take a moment to take it in. So, when wealth is accumulated, it allows us to live and retire with greater dignity, freedom, and peace of mind, and for our communities to be prosperous, resilient, and vibrant. Wealth allows us to provide future generations with the freedom to dream big and become all they truly can be. It means being healthy and knowing that your family, networks, communities are healthy, spiritually whole, and contributing. To achieve these forms of wealth, the practices, policies that deny and limit the accumulation of wealth and the extraction of wealth must be addressed head on. So this was a definition that we shared with our Equitable Wealth Initiative partners, and it really resonated with them. Some of them are actually using it today in some of their work. But I think this is kind of just thinking about it kind of in a broader sense. So I think our next slide is just taking a moment to pause. I know we're about halfway through. Oh, sorry. One more slide and then a pause moment. So just to kind of bring this all together, because again, I know we're trying to fit a lot in a little bit time, but just generally, what we kind of have come to some conclusion on and why we're focused on this work locally is really this idea of wealth being this key to long-term stability and resilience. Again, when we talk about poverty, we often focus on income, and that is due to a lot of different contributing factors. Wealth accumulation and extraction is nuanced and complex, and we need to unsilo this work so we don't perpetuate disjointed efforts. We invite you really to consider this issue structurally and systemically and go beyond the individual level, which a lot of our work tends to focus on, especially when it comes to savings and asset building. We can confront deeply embedded beliefs that perpetuate structural racism and anti-Blackness in ourselves, our institutions, and our policies. And we need more and better data to understand the nuance behind these inequities. And we need to unpack these go-to solutions about closing the racial wealth gap: housing, education, and income, which I'm going to pass it over to Sam momentarily to kind of start us thinking on dislodging some of these go-to solutions. So with that, I would love to just offer about a 2-minute reflection moment of, when you all, and maybe just taking a moment to jot into your notebook or on your computer, whatever feels more comfortable to you. But can you think of a time when these narratives or policies have shown up in your life? Can you think of a time you've seen these narratives and policies shown up in your work? And then can you make note of 3 words that are coming up for you at this moment? Feelings, thoughts, etc. And I offer this because we do believe that kind of mirror work and self-reflection are really important to shifting mindsets and thinking about things kind of on a deeper level. A lot of our work is so demanding and reactive and urgent that taking moments to pause, we believe, is really powerful. So I will mute myself and give you all about 2 minutes to think about these questions. Awesome. Well, thank you all for participating in that. And I would, encourage you, and we can make sure Eddie has the Unite for a Fair Economy boosts and blocks kind of figure in the follow-up materials. But when we did this with our roundtable participants around the Equitable Wealth Initiative, there were a lot of aha moments. And I think what I'll just share quickly is, one participant talked about how their grandfather got the GI Bill, and kind of really reflecting on the fact that that really supported their economic mobility kind of generationally. And I think when I think about this work and what we're starting to hear more is how important it is to tell stories of advantage, because we often focus on stories of disadvantage, and kind of I think both stories are important. So I just urge you all to maybe take some time and maybe ask some questions to your family members about some of these policies. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to my co-collaborator and co-presenter, Sam, who's going to walk us through kind of some of these go-to solutions when it comes to the racial wealth gap.
Okay. Thank you all for taking a moment to just reflect on those things. When we talked about what we might do, one of the elements, just a reminder, is to try to unpack or dislodge some of the ideas that we have around wealth building. And so what Alicia walked us through is an overview of narratives and mental models. And why might we start there? Because when we were thinking about how to address the racial wealth gap, we realized that for ourselves, and I'll use myself as an example more specifically, that there are certain pathways that we were saying, like, why isn't home ownership working? I bought a home, and this is going to be the wealth pathway, but I see myself so far away. And when I hear the statistics around, for every $100 that a white family might have, there's $8 for a Black family. How is that possible? And so we really needed to then take a step back and say, there's some narratives, there's some assumptions that we bring to looking for the solution and asking the questions. And some of those go-to solutions sort of fall into 3 buckets, and that's where we wanted to start with this work. There are intersections between each of these solutions, and so we want to be really clear about that. And there's also even stuff that's beyond just these 3 areas. But when we really try to distill it down into what we know and the ways in which mental models around toxic individualism and anti-Blackness were showing up, these were the areas where it was showing up. So with home ownership, understanding that we are expecting home ownership to solve a problem in a context of a real estate market and a home ownership market that is treating people differently. So there's discrimination inherent in that, and that is having an impact on the outcomes around home ownership. For education, very similarly, both the financing of that education and having the money to do that, as well as the outcomes, the labor market outcomes that are associated with high education and then access to education. We had to sort of take a step back and think that through. And then finally, once people are in the labor market, where are we seeing this sort of segregation of people being sorted into certain jobs based on certain characteristics? We really had to think about the ways in which systems are working related to our labor market, and that's having an impact. And so to the extent that we think any one or a combination of these 3 go-to solutions might start to address the problem, we had to step back and say, how are these narratives in this context affecting how we address this? And so we're going to take a little bit of a dive into home ownership, because that one is like one that is most familiar, and why we'll talk in just a minute about why that's important. And so when we look at that home ownership in the context of Philadelphia, colleagues of mine here at the Federal Reserve, Teresa Singleton and Lei Ding, they released a study around the home ownership gap, the Black-white home ownership gap in Philadelphia. I guess that was back in 2021. And compared to other similarly sized cities, Philadelphia has actually quite high single-family home ownership among Black residents. However, when you look at this slide here, you see that a gap has been persistent between white homeowners and Black homeowners in Philadelphia. So while compared to the national average, we are doing quite well, the gap has been consistent from 1960, and it has not decreased over the last 30 years. So this is important for us to think about, to the extent that how many people are realizing wealth building through homeownership, and how does that compare when we're thinking about addressing the racial wealth gap. This is just one piece that I had to sort of take a step back and say, oh, okay, this is a difference. But then more specifically, we're going to talk about what's the context within which Black residents in Philadelphia and white residents in Philadelphia are achieving and realizing the benefit of homeownership. So that's really about asking us to rethink homeownership as a wealth accumulation strategy. There are a couple of things that I want to say in terms of a reframe around this, and I have to give credit to Ann Price, who worked with us on our roundtable engagements. She released an article with Shelter Force, and there was an interview with her about being more critical around our notions of homeownership and what makes it effective. And so when we develop the overall notion of homeownership, we talked about racial discrimination. We talked about the accumulated boosts and blocks that are related to homeownership and how they differ by race. But we then have to think about, how do we reframe the goal of homeownership? And this includes some policy shifts that relate to how this asset can appreciate in the hands of Black people. And so this is not to diminish or in any way take away from down payment assistance programs and other programs that are being funded that help people achieve homeownership. But we also then have to think, what is the context within which that person's asset is going to appreciate? We know that because of segregation, some neighborhoods' home prices are appreciating at a much higher rate than others, and those tend to be predominantly white neighborhoods. So when we're looking at that as a solution, how are we really thinking about that asset and that asset's appreciation? We know that there are appraisal biases that have an impact on how we're going to ultimately think about the value that people can pull out of it. And then finally, for down payment assistance, for example, when you're thinking about that as a strategy, how much equity would a person get in that asset very early on? Equity is something that you earn from your asset as it appreciates over time. It doesn't have anything to do necessarily with how many hours you work, but it's something that you can tap into. And when we think about the role that wealth plays, looking back at the video with helping us to weather shocks or participating in certain aspects of consumption, the equity that you have up front in that asset is going to make a difference into how valued it can be. And so these are some of the ways in which we were looking at homeownership and having to reframe what is the context and what is the goal that we envision for homeownership, not just homeownership for homeownership's sake. Now, there are some situations where homeownership for homeownership's sake creates affordable housing, and it maintains someone's expenses so that they can make savings or other investments. And that's an important component of it as well. But I think illuminating all of the ways in which homeownership connects to wealth building is one of the things that we really had to focus in on. As it relates to the racial wealth gap, there are a couple of areas that we sort of were able to distill down the role of homeownership and thinking again about those goals and why owning a home may not provide the solution that narratives promise for Black, Latino, Native homeowners. The first one here is around access to credit. So mortgage debt generally tends to be more costly. And again, referencing those down payment assistance programs, special purpose credit programs, where you can see products that are able to give a more affordable credit access to homeowners of color, I think is really important. But access to credit is one of the main things. And we see disparities in that. So to the extent that we're thinking about homeownership, we need to be thinking about this system. Access to capital, different from credit, which would maybe be the mortgage products. It's that money, perhaps through an inheritance, perhaps through a gift that wasn't from your income, that was available to make the investment in a home. And we know that from research across the spectrum, nearly 30% of white families receive an inheritance or a gift compared to 10% of Black families. And so this is one of those situations where wealth begets wealth. And in the video, they talked about social investments, public investments, and then private investments. And this is one way that access to capital through private investments or social investments makes a real difference in the buying power of Black and Hispanic families. And finally, income. Differences in income are driving differences in savings rates and the ability to invest. But as you can see here, it's not the only factor that we have to consider. So we really had to then take a step back and say, is it about just increasing people's income through their work, or is it also about taking these other components into consideration when using homeownership as a vehicle to asset building and wealth building? Finally, we had to consider the context. There's a life cycle of homeownership in which people can realize the benefits of that assets the assets value increasing, and we wanted to be sure that we were aware of all of that context in our discussions around homeownership as a way to address the racial wealth gap. First, which I already mentioned, is the value of the home in and of itself. How much is it worth, and how does that fit into the broader market, and does that create an actual asset for a family? The second piece is related to the previous slide around access to credit and access to capital, which is the acquisition of that property. What is the process, and do we see structural racism showing up in acquisition and having an impact on what an individual buying power might be? The next thing is around the affordability, and that can have everything to do with the mortgage that you're able to achieve, how you're able to refinance that mortgage to realize affordability, and the cost of maintaining that property or even passing it along. This is something that when we think about inheritance and inheritance tax and other things that are related to that, what is the affordability around this particular asset? And then finally, the quality. We know through Kiana Yamada Taylor's work that there's been public investments in homeownership, but the properties and the quality of those properties resulted in an asset that couldn't appreciate and cost the homeowner all of the money that they had available. So they weren't able to realize any sort of liquidity. The liquidity that they had, they could not then build around that investment because the money just kept basically being extracted and siphoned off. So we raise this up because when we're thinking about home ownership and we're dealing with those mental models in the Equitable Wealth Initiative, we wanted to go a little bit deeper into this nuance to understand what might be more impactful pathways to building out assets and really building out wealth, particularly for Black and Hispanic and Asian Native households. So, as I said, it's really about sparking a new conversation around wealth inequality, and more specifically, wealth inequality that is driven by the racial wealth gap. We had our ecosystem roundtables where we took a deep dive into the research and data as well as the narratives. So the two things had to go hand in hand. And I love to call the research that we were able to highlight little research tasty bites, like the one that I just offered you, just a very high level way of maybe reinterpreting the data that we have with an understanding that we might have this historical context and we might have these mental models. We also thought it was really important for us to be able to move that conversation away from just the income-based poverty rate and get into things like asset building. So this isn't to say that Black and brown families don't own homes or this is the hill that we have to sort of overcome. It was these two things have to be working in tandem. And then we really need to move towards the inclusive wealth building when we're able to incorporate all of that, the narratives, the data, the research, moving beyond just income. Then we can start to imagine some inclusive wealth building strategies. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to invite Alicia to talk a little bit about the timeline and some of the topics that we covered in our roundtable engagements, and then we'll take another break for reflection.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. And you always do such a beautiful job presenting all that. And I do just want to emphasize, I think a point Sam made, but something I think about, like home ownership in itself isn't bad, right? Like we're not trying to say this is bad efforts to give. In our research, we heard about the Philly first-time home buyers assistance. These are meaningful things, especially when you think about people's lack of assets to capital. I think what we are just trying to disrupt is that this will close the racial wealth gap, which is, I think, a misnomer that I believe we've repeated too many times. And so we really just need to kind of reset ourselves and our expectations around that. So yeah, one of our initiatives, as Sam mentioned, was really readying our ecosystem to kind of have a more nuanced conversation. And so we were really fortunate to bring together about 20 stakeholders over the course of 6 months to really deep dive into these topics and really center learning versus like solutioning. And that was difficult for some of our roundtable participants because, again, we often, as you all probably want to, is like jumping to solutions, jumping to conclusions, but really wanted to create a real like learning space. And so as Sam said, we, grounded in history narratives, that was about 2 half-day sessions. We did a whole half day on home ownership. We were able to invite some local partners to kind of share some bright spots about what they were doing around navigating systems and integrated that learning. We talked about education and debt, and then we talked about the labor market. And then we really focused our last section on extraction and visioning forward. And then we were very fortunate to actually have a November symposium where we invited some national experts to really, again, broaden the conversation on wealth. Because I think if we can't emphasize it enough, we do think wealth is an underrepresented topic when it comes to poverty alleviation, not just in Philadelphia. I think this ripples outward. So one of our goals is just to really have conversations like this today to continue this on. And I'm gonna try to wrap up quickly. I think we just have a few more slides, but would love to hear if you all are having questions or any reflections at this point. Feel free to jump in the chat, or we can potentially also have you all come off mute. But yeah, we just wanted to share briefly. I know we couldn't go into the deep dive of kind of everything we covered in the ecosystem, but just really wanted to share, we did do an after session reflection. And, these were folks I didn't mention, but like from philanthropy, from the city, they were researchers, they were nonprofit practitioners. And really people reflected that like that was the biggest value to the experience, was just spending time with each other and really creating the space for honest, really nuanced conversations. These were leaders in our community. And so really creating some time for them to connect and to really kind of build this new, not even new, but maybe revision this new foundation of this work together. As Sam mentioned, and as I mentioned, and as SVP, I believe, does in their work, is this idea of really bringing our own experiences into the room, really creating value beyond kind of quantitative data, which is, again, part of how like white supremacy continues to perpetuate itself, is just through this kind of big data sets. And so really wanted to value lived experience along traditional data and research. And that was a very powerful experience from this. And the narrative work really resonated with folks. And I was able to go and talk to all the roundtable participants about 3 months after we finished the roundtables. And many people reflected that they've been able to bring those frames to their current workplace, and really has helped them be able to advocate more fully with their community and really talk about historical drivers, at a more robust level than they were before, which we think is really important. So moving forward, I think we have, so we are still in the middle of this work. As we mentioned, we're not expecting a year to solve about a 400-year problem is going to be enough, but we are at it, and we are committed to kind of continuing to create this shared vision of addressing racial wealth inequity in Philadelphia. We also have some research coming out. We weren't able to really talk about that component, but we will make sure Eddie and SVP has that research report, which was in partnership with Lisa Servon from the University of Pennsylvania, where we studied different elements of the racial wealth gap, but we talked about to 40 individuals across the city around home ownership and refinance, student debt, and criminal fines and fees. And so that research is actually coming out. Maybe I can have Sam give whatever update she can about that, but soon, it should be coming out soon. And so that's going to be really exciting research to share with our community to continue this conversation. And so we were wanting to give kind of a call to action of just kind of where we're at today with this work. And again, we wanted to create some, grace in this moment, because I think this is work that's continuing to unfold. But these are kind of where we're at today, of really trying to encourage people to continue to examine the root drivers of racial wealth inequities, thinking about historical policies, structural racisms, and that the narratives that really distract from making meaningful change forward. We want to think about capital. We want to think about how capital can serve many purposes, and how it's built and kind of continues to be accumulated by some. And yeah, I guess this next one is kind of focusing our efforts on extraction and on asset accumulation. I think when we think about someone having, again, who gets to buy a house, without any mortgage debt, and who is having to take on that mortgage debt and what that means for a family, I think we need to have a real conversation about that. And generally, again, I know SVP embraces this mindset as well, but like really supporting collaboration and emergent processes moving forward. I know there are some philanthropists on the call today, and I cannot emphasize enough about how important co-convening these different thought leaders were. And we're really excited to continue those conversations with our community partners. And we're really hoping that this research just kind of continues to spur conversation and hopeful action on the local and state level around this issue. So Sam, do you have anything to add, or before we wrap up, or give some space for questions?
I do want to leave space for question, but the only thing that I want to add, when we ask for a call to action, is really on point 2, which is capital can serve many purposes. Just as we talked about in the home ownership, there's a lot of different ways that dollars work together and get braided together to really address wealth accumulation. And so to the extent that, folks may be thinking about de-risking certain types of dollars with philanthropic funding, or that they're thinking about, can that create equity rather than just, someone having a mortgage? How much equity would they have? Are they able to maybe leverage that to start to build that foundation and that infrastructure that is conducive for wealth building? So I really want to focus on that. And I think that with this group and the conversations that you all are having, there's ways to really think creatively about how capital can work and different types of capital can work in communities to start to address, from a structural and systemic perspective, the wealth divide. So with that, I would love to open it up to any questions, things that are in the chat. Eddie, I'm going to look to you to help us with if there's a way that you prefer to do this.
Yeah. So I don't see any questions in the chat, but if someone wants to come off of chat and ask a question, you are more than welcome to. I have a question. I can ask a question if people are just feeling very bombarded with all the information that that was shared in this session. So maybe I will start with my question, and then if other folks want to chime in either in the chat or come off of mute, then they can. A lot of this work, Sam, maybe if you could talk a little bit about what you found scares people the most about shifting narratives around poverty. Philadelphia is a large city. We are inundated, some would say saturated, with nonprofits who have been having the conversation around poverty for years. And those conversations, yes, continue to evolve. So in this work, what have you found people are most afraid of with regards to shifting these narratives around poverty?
Thank you for that question. I think there are a couple of things. I think one is narrative work is less concrete. And so really bringing people into a space to try to get a handle on what are the narratives that we're bringing, what are the mental models that are informing our work, and how might that demand us to show up differently in our investments and in whatever programming we have, I think is really hard, because you need to take a moment for that recognition that funders might not always, be open to you having if you're in the nonprofit space. I think the second piece is one that we're really starting to amplify with the research report coming out, which is there's resistance because the problem's hard to define. The data is really challenging. Understanding a wealth portfolio and all of those contributing factors, the social investments, the public investments, the private and personal investments, means that it's hard to get that local data to understand what is the right, I'm going to say like cocktail of things that you need to address. So is it something as straightforward as entrepreneurship, or does that entrepreneurship have to happen in a certain context? Home ownership, does that have to happen in a certain context in order for it to be a driver of wealth? So that's the second piece. I think that's really hard, and it's hard for leaders to take a step back. I'll speak for myself. When I worked in city government and I worked on, focusing on poverty, having the time to really just get your arms around that was difficult. And now, coming from a different perspective, even at the Fed, when I think through what is my wish, that be a more systematic way for us to gain those data and really then be able to ask the questions differently. And then the last part is how hairy structural racism is to talk about. It's just very hard to talk about, and we still don't have a comfort with that. Even in the moments that felt very candid as a result of George Floyd's murder, I think it's still difficult to talk about, power with versus power over. It's hard to talk about how many elements of our system drive the divide.
Alicia, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think I'm struck recently by this idea of control and compliance, and how much our systems focus on controlling people's behavior, and the time and money and bureaucracy that's spent from top to bottom thinking about control and compliance. And I think what I wanted to share is, I think, SBP adopting trust-based philanthropy, I think, is really important. This idea of how do we start really mirroring what we want people to experience in our institutions and in our systems, I think, is really important. But I think there is a lot of work to do. I think, Eddie, you kind of alluded to it, if I may say so myself, is like, there's a lot of nonprofits who now have identity around, and I say this as someone who used to work in a lot of social service systems across the country at my old nonprofit. And there's identity in this work. When you think about case managers, right? Like, my job is to manage this case, like even that language, right? And so I think about narrative work, I think about language, I think about how can we not make this work, the more we can lean into complexity and nuance and not simplicity of when I think about numbers going up, right? Like, we want to see the numbers go up, we want to see the people being served go up. But I don't know if that's the right direction. I think that's uncomfortable for people, because I think a lot of our work and our identity is focused on numbers and control and compliance. And I say that as not just from this work, but just from my previous work in nonprofits. And so I think we have to take a little bit more risk about how we're talking about this, and we have to be willing to tell the truth about kind of what progress is going to look like. And it's going to be messy and it's going to be emergent. But all I can say is, what we're doing right now isn't working, right? So we got to try new things, and got to try to disrupt some of these really ingrained neo-paternalistic and anti-Black thought processes that I think are really sticky. I think, and I say this, my last thing is just Ann Price, who we're very just fortunate to have as a partner. She's been talking about narratives for decades now, and just like, she just talks about the stickiness of these things. So the constant vigilance to them, I think is necessary.
Thank you. I don't know. Okay. Caroline, we see your question. Can you talk a little bit, Sam, Alicia, about what you mean by extraction?
Yeah, I'm sure I should have just like the definition at my fingertips. Sam, I'll definitely let you add on to this one. But, what I believe, what we're referring to is really like this idea of debt, criminal fines and fees. When you think about, when I think about overdraft fees, when I think about student debt, I think about anything, when you think about net worth, right? It's assets minus liabilities. So I think the extraction is the process that our economy has on that negative side of the equation. There's a great new book by Matthew, sorry to mention another book, but Matthew Desmond just came out with this book called Poverty by America. And he talks about the exploitation and extraction of people who are experiencing poverty in this country, wage theft, man, it just goes on and on about, I think when it comes down to it, what I'm really sitting with is if you don't have the capital to invest, you're having to debt finance these opportunities, and it's leaving you more vulnerable, and it's decreasing your asset holdings. So I think when we talk about extraction, we're really talking about the way the systems are not allowing you to kind of get ahead. A very concrete example, Sam, before I pass it back to you, but like this whole idea of refinance. So the Fed did some great research that low-income people and people of color were rejected at a higher rate when the interest rates dropped, to I think a 2.5, during the pandemic, and they were rejected at higher rates, which again is an extraction of their income, right? Because now they're not getting that lower interest rate on their mortgage, and therefore they're paying more towards that holding. So I think it could be, Anyway, Sam, what would you say, or what did I miss or mess up?
You didn't mess up anything, but I think just to try to make it really concrete this is ways in which your income is diminished because of the cost of whatever the good and service may be, or the deterioration of your asset's value because of the cost of acquiring or maintaining that asset, right? So that's just like straight up, if we think about, you can shelter some income, and we see that happen with, if we think about benefits that certain jobs offer, your income can be sheltered from taxes if you're able to use these other mechanisms, and that turns into an asset for you, whether that's through your retirement account or an IRA or some other product. Or your asset in and of itself, in some ways, is you're siphoning off the value of that asset when you have mortgages that require perhaps the mortgage insurance, the PMI. So then you immediately, that's money that you would be putting into that asset. It's not going to the value of that asset. So when we're thinking about that, it crosses a lot of spectrums. Alicia tried to lift up a few illustrative examples, but there are many more ways that when you want to look at a subject, thinking about the debt or any sort of extractive component of it, as a feature of, is this driving towards wealth building, and how is that driving us for that asset to really appreciate over time, I think is where we're trying to help people see.
Thanks for that. So in the last 5 minutes, if there aren't any other questions, Evan, I see your message in the chat box. Folks, reach out to each other. Sam, Alicia, can you let us know how to reach you and what to look for next? Because I think it got a little lost in the presentation, but what can folks on this call look to next?
Yes, happy to share our email addresses in the presentation and in the follow-up. These slides can be made available as well. At the Federal Reserve, we have a landing page for the Equitable Wealth Initiative where you'll be able to find out more about the roundtables, a summary of what those events were. We'll also be releasing a research paper, which I'm really happy we used primarily qualitative research methods to understand the experiences of wealth building in Philadelphia. And we worked with Lisa Servon on that work. I'm really excited by the fact that we were able to center the voices of Black women in Philadelphia. That's mostly because we used a convenient sampling methodology, and those were the Philadelphians that raised their hand to talk about you know, everything from mortgage refinance and home ownership to student loans and their experience with criminal justice fines and fees. So we're looking forward to that research release. And then we hope to re-engage with convenings later this year, going into early next year. And those announcements will also be available through the Federal Reserve's landing page on this initiative. So we'll share the link to the landing page. We'll definitely be following up with the research report, and we'll definitely share our contact information.
Great, thank you so much. So I put in the chat box, again, we will send everyone the recording, the slides, we'll make all of that available in a follow-up email between tomorrow and the next day. I threw in my contact information, including a session feedback survey. Thank you for showing us grace in our earlier tech issues. There's always something, right? But feel free to fill out the survey. We really appreciate it. It actually helps us to design this level of learning for SVP. Again, you can find us on LinkedIn. Our website is there. Sorry, the link, it looks like it's not working. But also my email is there. So if you are interested in learning more about Social Venture Partners Philadelphia and the work that we do in partnership with Sam and Alicia and a couple of other initiatives that are happening, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to talk about all the ways you can get involved. And there are a ton of people at United Way that I'm sure will be happy to talk to you as well. So if there are no follow-up questions, thoughts, comments from any of our partners who I see are online, I will give you a minute back to your lives. Thank you again for your patience and just for being here with us today. It was really, thank you so much, Sam and Alicia, and for everyone on the call for making it into the room, even with tech issues. All right, everyone have a great afternoon. We'll see you soon. Bye.